Good evening, all, and thank you for being at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics today to hear from Secretary of the Army, Christine E. Wormuth, about the Army of the Future as a part of the IOP Speaker Series. My name is Captain Amanda Fredrickson, and I'm a first-year Master of Public Policy student at Harris. I'm originally from West Point, New York, and I will return to teach economics at the United States Military Academy following completion of my time at the University of Chicago. I joined the Army to follow my family's tradition of service, but I continued serving because of the amazing soldiers and families I met throughout my 8 years on active duty. It is truly a joy to see the first woman to serve as the Secretary of the Army travel around the world, meeting and highlighting these same soldiers and families. Today, we have the honor of hearing from the Honorable Christine E. Wormuth, confirmed as the 25th Secretary of the Army on May 27, 2021. Previously, Secretary Wormuth was the director of the International Defense and Security Center at the RAND Corporation, responsible for more than $30 million in research and analytical support, as well as many assignments in public service in the Obama administration, including Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Homeland Defense, and more. Our moderator tonight is Jen Steinhauer, the director of the IOP Speaker Series, who reported for the New York Times until joining the IOP last year. Jen has written extensively on defense, government, and policy issues, and I look forward to their conversation. 2 upcoming Speaker Series events are tomorrow, February 15th, Welcome to the Mosaic, The Rise of Black Mayors in American Cities at the International House Assembly Hall. The discussion will take place at 5:30 p.m. and feature Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, New Orleans Mayor LaToya Cantrell, former Shreveport Mayor Adrian Perkins, and former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. On February 20th, come watch 3 teams of students compete in a policy challenge aimed at fixing Chicago's transportation system. That event will be at the Ida Noyes Cloister Club at 5 p.m. Finally, please silence or turn off your cell phones if you have not already. After the main discussion, we will have a microphone that attendees can approach for the question and answer portion. Please join me in a warm welcome for Secretary of the Army, the Honorable Christine E. Wormuth and Jen Steinhauer.
Thank you, and thank you for being here, and thank you for demonstrating to everybody at the university what proper footwear looks like in the military. We're so pleased to see it. So look, we know that the modern military is made up of a very small percentage of the American population. Tends to be generational families serving, and many people can grow up, including on this campus, and never meet anybody serving the military. At the same time, obviously, the military reflects the entirety of our nation, regionally, across class, race, gender, political orientation, even though it may not always be perceived that way. And the Army's being the largest service branch is perhaps the greatest mirror on American society writ large. So I wanted to focus a lot today on what that means in contemporary America, what the contemporary Army looks like as that mirror, and especially as it pertains to recruitment, retention, and the larger goals that you have for the modern Army. Certainly being the first woman in this role does reflect part of that dynamic. So I thought maybe you could start us off a little bit with a wide lens, telling us a bit about your own career path, inclusive of the parts that maybe where you hit bends in the road that you didn't expect to end here.
Sure. Well, I guess, one thing I would say is I am the first woman Secretary of the Army, but I also have not served in uniform myself. So I have been a civilian. My professional career has been about public service. I basically graduated from college and thought that I wanted to go to law school. So I went and worked as a paralegal in Washington, D.C., but at a venerable Chicago-based firm, Sedley and Austin. But I realized from that experience that I wasn't sure that I really wanted to be a lawyer. My grandfather served in the United States Army in World War II, but frankly, I think like a lot of World War II veterans, he didn't talk about that very much with me. And actually, I learned much later in life that my grandpa, when he came back, he served in the Pacific. He packed parachutes because at that time we had the Army Air Corps. And when Grandpa came home, he actually didn't work for a year because I think he was struggling with, what we would now call PTSD. But, back then you didn't really talk about it. So I didn't grow up around the military. In fact, my parents were graduate students out in California during the Vietnam War, and they actually, told me stories when I was growing up about how they took me to war protests, in a little baby backpack. But my parents did really believe in public service. They were educators. They worked at a university. I grew up in College Station, Texas, home of Texas A&M University. And through a lot of the things that my parents did, my mom ran the Center for English as a Second Language. And so I grew up around foreign students from all over the world. I met, students from Saudi Arabia, from Iran, from Central America. And I think that got the wheels turning for me about international affairs. And then when I went to college, I went to Williams College in Massachusetts. I started to sort of hone in on national security. I spent my junior year in Paris when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. I'm dating myself. And then, the same year I graduated from college, the Soviet Union collapsed. And that was a really fascinating time, and it kind of crystallized my interest in national security. And I went to graduate school in public policy. So, shout out to all of you who are from the Harris School of Public Policy. And I got into the Pentagon through a program called the Presidential Management Fellows. And for any of you in the audience who are graduate students and who are interested in government service, I would strongly encourage you to look at the PMF program. It's an incredibly terrific program that brings people out of public policy schools into the executive branch. And that's really how I came into the Department of Defense. And the rest for me, I was bitten by the bug, worked alongside the military. That's when I started working alongside the Army as well as the other services, and just found it incredibly challenging and satisfying work. So it kind of one thing led to the other. I would say in terms of derailments, the federal government is a bureaucracy, and I worked for almost 7 years as a civil servant, but I really wanted to manage people. I wanted to sort of, be in charge of things a little bit. I thought that was something I might be good at, but upward mobility wasn't always what I hoped it would be. So I decided to kind of roll the dice and leave a very secure government job and go out and do something different. So I went into the private sector. I worked at a think tank in DC for a few years. And again, took kind of a gamble. I wanted to come back to the Pentagon, and the pathway that I was able to do that through was becoming a political appointee. But there's a lot of luck and timing that's involved in that. So, a lot of the things I would say that have allowed me to be successful and to kind of make leaps into new positions has been kind of luck and timing.
Mm-hmm. So when you got into this position in the Army, I'm curious, what struck you when you first walk into the top leadership position of an organization? You think, what was sort of most striking to you, and how has that kind of informed your approach into how you see yourself leading the future of this branch?
I think the thing that most surprised me is, I had spent a lot of time with the Army, as we say in the Army, downrange. Through my work in the Pentagon, I had worked a lot on the big national security problems. I was very involved in the counter-ISIS campaign. So I had seen our Army in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Europe, in places all over the world. What I didn't understand as much and what I didn't appreciate was all that goes into taking care of an Army as large as ours. We're almost 1 million people. We have the active Army, we have the Guard and the reserves, and taking care of 1 million people and all of their families, providing daycare for them. We have our own schools in the Department of Defense. We actually run, believe it or not, department stores, as well as commissaries, which is, Army speak for grocery stores. And we also have something, else I didn't realize is the Army basically in the years of World War II, we, in that great mobilization to win the war against Nazi Germany, we have a huge organic industrial base. We have arsenals, depots, ammunition plants all around the country. I just visited one in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where we make 155 millimeter casings, the shells, for the artillery that the Ukrainians are using so well. And I had no idea before I became Secretary of the Army that we, of all of these things, this huge organic industrial base, this huge inventory of family housing, of barracks, That is all the important stuff that I would say kind of goes on behind the scenes that you have to enable the pointy part of the spear to do the important work of protecting and defending this nation.
So when we think about artillery, when we think about the Army, we don't think about child care centers. We don't think about the spouses of people serving and what it's like to have to move all the time and not be able to get a job because you're constantly being uprooted as a family. We think a little bit about housing because it's been in the news, usually not in a very positive way. So what's been your approach to those things? I mean, I imagine that these are components that can be challenges for you both in recruitment and retention.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things that I do as Secretary of the Army, working with the four-star general who's the Chief of Staff of the Army, James McConville, is figuring out, okay, we have $180 billion annually for our budget, which is enormous in many ways. But actually, given all of the things that we have to invest in, it is always a challenge to kind of to figure out what is the balance between building new weapon systems, providing salary and benefits, building new child care centers, building new barracks, for example. It's always a challenge to figure out where to spend that incremental dollar. I would say for us, my assessment at almost 2 years as Secretary of the Army is that we have underinvested in the last few years in barracks and housing. And some of that was because we had something called sequestration back in kind of 2013, 2014, where we were basically stripping money out of the defense budget. And a lot of what we did to get through those times was kind of take money out of the infrastructure accounts and put it into the training accounts so that our soldiers could still train. But now kind of, we're paying the piper a little bit. So we're currently spending about $1 billion on barracks every year. But I think we probably need to spend a little more than that. We have a 10-year facilities investment plan that helps us decide where to make our investments. But particularly given the recruiting challenges we're having, I think the burden is really on us to make sure that we're providing safe, adequate barracks housing for our families. And one thing the Army has done, and they started this before I got to become Secretary of the Army, is we've actually privatized a lot of our family housing and have been working with companies, to tear down old homes and build new homes. And on balance, I think that's a pretty successful partnership, but we have had challenges with our privatized housing companies. And so we're really working closely with them to hold their feet to the fire and make sure that they're maintaining those homes the way that they need to.
That's interesting too, because when usually during sequestration and other times of downturns in domestic spending, what you hear lawmakers mostly talk about is we won't be able to defend our nation, we won't be able to fight abroad. When it sounds like what you're saying is no, we're actually disinvesting in the humans who are serving, whether it's their homes or schools or things like that, have actually been where the pain points have been, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, those were decisions that were made before I got there. I mean, actually, I was working in the Pentagon during sequestration. I just wasn't obviously serving in the Army. And I think those were arguably reasonable choices to have made at the time. And we all know balancing our own personal budgets and things, sometimes, something is a priority one year and it's less of a priority the next year. But fundamentally, we have a moral contract with our soldiers and their families to provide for them and take care for them. And so I think we've got to, always look carefully at our investment in housing.
Let's talk about who you see serving now and how maybe changing demographics within the military writ large and certainly in the Army over the last 10 years, 20 years. First of all, I guess we should just start with what have you seen? How much do you think there has been a shift?
Well, I would say I'm very proud of the diversity of the United States Army. I mean, I always say it's really important that the Army reflect the country that it serves and look like the country that it serves. And we're, as the biggest service, it's probably not surprising that we have people from all over the country, people from, frankly, many countries overseas. We have soldiers who are from Nigeria, Ukraine. I've met a soldier from Iraq. We have soldiers from Jamaica. And, so that's something that I'm really proud of. And I would say we probably have about right now 19% of the United States Army are women. And you're starting to see that diversity be reflected in the leadership ranks at the 3- and 4-star level. So, we have General Gary Brito, who's the head of our Training and Doctrine Command. He is African American. Daryl Williams, who is our commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe and the Pacific, is African American. General Lori Robinson is our United States Southcom commander. She has basically responsibility for all of Latin America. She's, a 4-star female Army general. So you continue, I think, to see very good representation of all of the different people who live and work in the United States, in the United States Army. I think what's really changing is that it's become really a family business to a degree that I think is becoming a little bit too pronounced. 83% of the people serving in uniform today, not just in the Army, but in other services, come from military families. And that means, a very small percentage of our force actually are people like me who didn't grow up in a military family. And if we, only continue to recruit from young Americans who are already connected to the military, we're going to run out of people. So we've got to find a way to broaden our appeal or do a better job of talking to young Americans and their parents about what serving in the military can offer. And I think there are tremendous opportunities for people serving in uniform.
I do want to unpack some of that in various levels. Let's talk a little bit more, another beat about women. Because one of the challenges, I can very much remember being at a hearing with the late Senator John McCain when he said, someone asked him, one of his neighbors, would you recommend that my daughter join the military? And he said he didn't feel he could at that time. This is when there were some very high profile sexual assault cases in the news. And we've those numbers have remained stubbornly high. We obviously are all very familiar with the Vanessa Guillen story. I think that's now the subject of a documentary. I mean, I would imagine that has been something that you've concerned yourself with. And what do you say to someone whose daughter is considering joining the Army and they see all these high profile sexual assault cases, they see what's going on with the numbers? How do you candidly address that with that family?
Yeah, well, I do get those kinds of questions. And what I would say is, first of all, we're a reflection of society. Sexual harassment, sexual assault is not a military unique problem. It's not an Army unique problem. Unfortunately, it's a problem in our society. But I acknowledge that, we have a very bright spotlight. And I think people hold the United States military to a higher standard. We're one of the most trusted institutions in the country. And so we have got to find ways to get after this problem and prove that we can do better to parents and to young people who would consider service. And we are trying to do a lot. I mean, the Vanessa Guillen murder was a searing experience. It was a tragedy. And for the United States Army, it was a really searing experience. Again, this happened before I became Secretary of the Army, but I think, I remember reading the report as I was preparing for my confirmation hearings, and I was furious, and working in the Pentagon as many years as I have, I've heard a lot about the sexual harassment and sexual assault cases and have seen, lots of 4-star generals and admirals testify in front of Congress saying, we're going to get our arms around this. And I think, frankly, the Congress just lost trust in the Army and in the other services as a result of what happened. So we are trying to demonstrate through action that we are worthy of that trust. And a lot of what we're trying to do is focus on preventing sexual harassment and sexual assault in the first place. Previously, I think the Army focused a lot of its attention on responding to those events after they happened, providing care, providing victims advocates to people who had been assaulted or harassed. But we really need to kind of get left a boom, as we would say in the Army. But as you all know, in the university setting, it's hard. I mean, colleges and universities have not cracked this code either. The way that we're trying to deal with it is really from the moment a young person joins the United States Army, they start getting training on what is okay and what is not okay. And we do, in-person small group training to talk about what sexual harassment is, what sexual assault is, what kinds of behaviors you can do and what you cannot do. And so that kind of work has to happen kind of at the lowest squad level. And it takes really engaged leadership. And we have really tried to message to our leaders in the Army that this is important. It's as important as training for warfighting, and you've got to pay attention to it. And then I would say on the response side, something that we're doing, which Congress, mandated, was basically take prosecution of those kinds of crimes out of the chain of command and have them be prosecuted by professional, in some cases military lawyers, but in other cases civilian lawyers who are experts in those kinds of cases, and they report directly to me through a new brigadier general named Warren Wells. And the idea there is that, now people who are victims of that kind of behavior don't have to worry that they may, not get a fair deal, or that a company commander may show favoritism to the person who is actually the perpetrator. This is something that I think, we haven't done this before. It was controversial, frankly, inside of the military. But I think, like I said, Congress lost trust, and we now have to prove that we can earn that trust back.
That was resisted for so many years by every SecDef, every Joint Chiefs for the longest time. So that's a definite sea change. I forgot to ask if you've taken the Army fitness test. That was something else that we've heard women complain a lot about. I mean, again, just trying to level the playing field, but also making it something that women want to participate in. I suppose I'm wondering just if there's anything else that you would say to women in terms of recruitment. What's the incentive? How do you incentivize women to participate in the Army?
Well, I mean, I would make the same pitch to women joining the Army that I would make to men, frankly, and it's about opportunities. It's about, being able to choose from 178 different military occupational specialties. It's about the kind of leadership development, confidence that you get, as well as all the practical benefits of the GI Bill, tuition assistance. We now have we have 12 weeks of paid parental leave for both men and women. So if you have a baby, if you adopt a baby, if you foster a child, you can take 12 weeks off to be with your new child, whether you're, a mom or a dad. And that's a really big change for the United States military. There's always been worry about what will that do to our readiness levels. But I think we have to show that, you don't have to choose between a career in the United States military, or even not a career, maybe just a few years in the United States military. You don't have to choose between that and having a family.
So I'm just unpacking a little bit more around some of the diversity issues within the military. It's ever since, President Truman integrated the military, Americans have kind of debated whether the service branches should lead or lag civilian society on all sorts of social issues concerning race, gender, sexual orientation. We know the Marine Corps was early in banning displays of Confederate symbols. The Army Confederate generals, bases named after Confederate generals, that was changed very recently. I think it was the Army that prohibited photographs from promotional packages that would indicate race, gender, ethnicity. And at the same time, we're seeing from certain corners the military being described as too woke. So what's your interpretation of that? How do you kind of process that, all of that?
It is a lot to process some days. First of all, I would say, again, I truly believe that it's important that the United States Army reflect the country that it serves. So I think we have to be an institution that is welcoming of everyone, all colors, all races, all genders. And really, part of the reason that's important is because at the end of the day, we have to build cohesive teams of people who trust each other. If you're out on the battlefield, you've got to feel confident that the person on your right and left are going to be there for you. And, teams that are inclusive and are basically giving people, respect and acceptance, no matter where they may come from, that's really important. And that helps build that trust. So we're not, I don't think that the Army should be a social experiment, but the reason that we emphasize diversity and we want to make sure everyone feels accepted and respected is so that we can have those cohesive teams who can be effective at what they do.
And in terms of other challenges reflecting American society, experts and lawmakers, service members have identified one of the main persistent problems is the unaddressed mental health issues and very stubborn suicide rates among troops and veterans. At the same time, I know that the military has been trying very hard to destigmatize mental health problems in the military. What's the progress there? What can you candidly tell us? Because again, this has just been one of those things that I feel like we write about every single year, and we have these sort of persistent, stagnant numbers.
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately, suicide is another one of those societal problems that you see, reflected in the mirror of the United States Army. We are working very, very hard to try to reduce suicide in the United States Army, and I think, I was very pleased that the number of deaths by suicide last year in the Army was lower than the previous year. So I think some of the things that we've been doing are starting to take effect. One thing I think is really important to get out there is that actually, I think a lot of people think, members of the Army who die by suicide, it's because of deployments, it's because of combat experiences they've had, it's because of, PTSD, for example. In fact, that most of the suicide that we see in the United States Army is not by soldiers who have been deployed. Actually, the average person in the Army who dies by suicide is a white male between the ages of 18 usually and 24, I think. It's usually with a firearm, unfortunately, and it's often, when we go in and look at what's happened and try to understand what's happened, it's often connected to substance abuse, financial strain, relationship difficulties. It's a lot of things, unfortunately, that, people struggle with in the civilian world all the time as well. So part of what we're trying to do is, first of all, educate our leaders for sort of what to look for, to see if there are risk factors. If you know you have a soldier in your unit who is struggling with debt or is having marital problems, keep a closer eye on that individual. It's like in some ways, the approach we've taken to trying to deal with sexual harassment, which is trying to get down there kind of at the squad level and have our soldiers look out for one another. General McConville sometimes talks about the golden triangle. It's making sure that a soldier is connected to a buddy, is connected to their leader, and is connected to a member of their family. Because if you have those connections, you have a better chance of seeing sometimes if there's an indication of a problem.
So let's go back to recruiting and retention, looking at two sides of the coin. On the one side, let's talk about high-achieving Army officers who have a lot of opportunities in the private sector. How do you maintain someone like that? Assuming you want to. I assume you do.
Yeah, we certainly try to retain as many high-quality people in the Army as we can on any given day. We have a couple of ways of retaining really talented young officers, of which there are many. In some cases, we have, basically retention bonuses. So for example, for some of our pilots, they get fairly large retention bonuses to keep them. And of course, we need those financial incentives because a lot of times the commercial airlines are always trying to recruit our pilots, for example. But what I have found a lot of times is that people re-enlisting in the Army, whether it's officers or enlisted, a lot of times do it because of the feeling of serving a higher purpose, being part of something that really matters, and also kind of having a second family. A lot of times you'll hear people in the Army talk about, I stayed for the people, for that sense of community. And that's something that, you can't put a price tag on.
Now, on the flip side of it, you're here at a university, and I know you've been visiting other colleges while you're here in the Chicago area. Again, vis-a-vis other choices, but also, candidly speaking, after 20 years of war, which many people in our society, including many military veterans, were displeased with the end game there, a disenchantment. And a disenchantment even with the notion of American exceptionalism, many of the other incentives that brought people after 9/11 and others into the military. How do you come to a campus like Chicago or frankly anywhere, and what do you look at a student, and how do you kind of appeal to them that a career in the Army is something not only worth doing but attractive?
Well, again, fundamentally, I think the case that I would make that something the Army offers that, civilian employers don't offer in a lot of cases is that sense of being part of something bigger. There really isn't any bigger, more important mission than protecting the country, defending the country, keeping people safe. And then on top of that, we do offer incredible benefits, incredible training, incredible leader development. So I think, and the other thing I would offer is, as someone who spent 30 years working in national security, I started at the end of the Cold War. I was on maternity leave the day of 9/11 when the Pentagon was attacked. I went back into the Pentagon a week after the attacks and could still, smell the burning building. So I saw the long years of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. And now, we're looking at dealing with nation state threats again, whether it's a revisionist Russia or, a very aggressive China. And I see the national security environment as the most challenging, most dangerous it's ever been. And so in my view, it is critically important to have a strong military that can protect our country and look out for our United States interests. And I think being a part of that, whether you're serving in uniform or serving as I've done as a civil servant, is incredibly powerful. You're not going to get rich doing it, but it can be, I think, incredibly fulfilling and satisfying.
So in a few minutes, we're going to go to questions. So start formulating them in your brain. You'll be able to raise your hand, and we'll have someone walking around with the mic. I know we've been talking a lot about personnel issues, and I'm grateful that we've been able to discuss that. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a few questions not on that subject. You mentioned Ukraine, I think, or at least Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. The Army has played an important role. Maybe we did not foresee in supporting them there. And the United States is meant to provide 31 M1 Abrams tanks, I think, at some point. Do you see a timeline on that? And what other role do you see the Army doing in terms of supporting Ukraine?
Sure. I'll get to the tanks. Right now we have 100,000 military personnel in Europe, and 50,000 of those personnel are United States Army soldiers. A lot of what the Army is doing is kind of standing shoulder to shoulder with our NATO allies, whether it's in Poland, the Baltic countries, whether it's in Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, really sort of standing shoulder to shoulder to demonstrate deterrence against Putin, to make sure that he doesn't step over the line and step into a NATO country. But the other really important thing that the Army has been doing is providing lethal assistance to the Ukrainians. I can rattle off tons of facts and figures. We've given them MRAPs, which are the vehicles that we used so successfully to protect our soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've given them Bradleys. We've given them Stryker fighter vehicles. We've given them howitzers and, over almost 600,000 rounds of artillery to shoot back against the Russian Army. We are now giving them the Patriot system, which is an air defense system to try to protect them from some of the incoming missiles. We've given them some older air defense systems as well. And as you just said, Jennifer, President Biden, agreed to give them some Abrams tanks, which are the best tanks in the world. Those are very sophisticated pieces of equipment, as is the Patriot, frankly, and you don't just learn how to operate a tank overnight. So we're still in the process of figuring out which version of the tank to get to them. We have a number of versions that are in our inventory and that we make, and then also sort of how to get them there. And so those options are still being formulated and presented to Secretary Austin. But I think the most important thing about the president's decision to give tanks to the Ukrainians is that it unlocked, the tanks from other countries, like the Leopard tanks from the Germans, for example, or the Challenger tanks from the Brits, which are going to be able to get there more quickly and are a little bit easier for the Ukrainians to operate.
According to the clock, I have 60 more seconds, so I'm just going to ask you one quick thing, and then we are going to go to questions. You can go ahead and start raising your hand, and Joel will come around with the mic. I guess just you're here at the IOP, so I would love to just ask you quickly if you could just emphasize what you think is the importance of civic engagement in service.
Yeah, I mean, with all of the things that we have to solve, these days, like I said, most challenging national security environment that I've seen in 3 decades, climate change, racial and economic inequality, threats to our democracy. There's a lot of hard work that needs to be done out there. So my view is, service is incredibly important. And we've also, the country has just gone through such a traumatic event with the pandemic. We have, medical professionals and nurses who are overburdened, burnt out. It's a really hard time to be a teacher. It's a really hard time to be somebody in law enforcement. So, there's a huge need for service in our country.
Great. Do someone want to get started? We'd like to start with students, please. Go ahead.
Hi, ma'am. I'm Dan Tully. I'm a MEA student here at Booth. I'm also a captain in the Judge Advocate Corps. I was curious, with an eye toward future threats from cyber, would you be in favor of the creation of a cyber-specific branch of the military, or do you think that the organizational structure with each branch having its own components, so Army Cyber, do you think that's sufficient for the threat? Thank you.
My sense is, my instinct would be to keep the cyber inside of the home military branches, because one of the things I found, for example, is we now have a Space Force, obviously, and before we had Space Force, when you thought about space, you thought about the Air Force. Actually, the Army is the biggest consumer of space capabilities. We use it on the ground. And I raise that to say that I think each service has its own unique needs in terms of capabilities, its own unique organizational culture. And so I think rather than having a separate cyber service, keeping the functional expertise inside the service allows you to tailor it to what that particular service needs.
Hi, first I want to thank you for coming to meet with us. My name's Claire. I'm a fourth year in the college studying economics and public policy. I'm actually in the midst of writing a thesis in public policy on the sale of AI that has defense applications. And I'm curious now, with the war in Ukraine, and you're seeing Palantir selling these software algorithms that are used for geolocation signal mapping and other such troop mapping as well. Kind of moving forward, I understand the caution that the military's had with having more applications of AI within it, how you're seeing with this application in the real world in Ukraine, what that is moving forward with having these private partnerships with AI software. Thank you.
I think, artificial intelligence, machine learning, human-machine teaming, quantum computing, those are all going to be capabilities that we are going to need in abundance in the future. And, and AI is already here, to your point about, the work that we've been doing with Palantir. And I think, we in the Army have been trying to develop some organic capability ourselves. So for example, we have an artificial intelligence center at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, because we recognize how important that's going to be, and we need to develop that capability internally. But there are obviously, amazing companies, whether they're well-known ones like Palantir or, smaller startups that are doing great innovative things, and we want to take advantage of that. And I think, frankly, we want to try to take advantage of that more quickly. The way the Army and the other military departments have acquired capabilities over the years is a very time-consuming process, and the commercial sector in a lot of ways is so much farther ahead of us that I think particularly now as AI is still pretty new, we need to partner with companies like Palantir. And just for folks who are maybe not as familiar with what they're doing as Claire is, the Army uses incredible amounts of data. We need to know, where are our forces in the battle space? Where are the enemy forces in the battle space? What is the terrain? What is the weather? Where are the satellites? But it's hard to bring all of that together into one place where, a colonel, for example, can see all of that simultaneously. And particularly with the speed of decision-making speeding up on today's battlefield and on the future battlefield, you really need to bring that all together. And companies like Palantir have been able to help us merge hundreds of data sets together and be able to do it in a way that allows us to have visualizations that help us speed up the decision-making loop from sort of days to hours in a lot of cases. It's very, very powerful.
But if I could just ask you a quick follow-up on the flipping that question around, does it freak you out at all, though? This is that the AI freak out is sort of where we are thematically in looking at AI. In a position of someone as a leader in the military, does that keep you up at night at all?
Yeah, I've seen Terminator, I've seen Skynet. I definitely think, just because you have a technology does not mean you necessarily should use that technology. And we are on the frontier, and I think it's incredibly important for us to be thinking about the ethics of artificial intelligence and the importance of keeping humans in the loop, particularly when you have something that's going to take a human life. We've already seen, frankly, in the last 20 years, we can have civilian casualties sometimes that are unintended. And that's the kind of, I think, that could be, greatly magnified through artificial intelligence. So I fully support the kind of work and thinking and research into how do we develop our AI capabilities in a way that are consistent with our values.
Sir?
Hello, my name is Seamus Murphy. I'm a first year at the Harris School. Thank you for coming out. I'm also an Army veteran, served for 6 years, got a staff sergeant. I have a question about transitioning service members and the, let's just say I had an unpleasant exit in 2012, and I know ACAP is now a Soldier for Life program. I'm just wondering, and from my perspective, it falls short in certain areas, but I'm just wondering, is there any plan to expand access to the SkillBridge program, as well as look at empowering, especially enlisted service members as they exit, to have successful transitions, which might also help with recruitment, as they could act as micro-influencers, and the suicide problem that's currently happening with the community? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for being part of the Army and for being a Soldier for Life. The SkillBridge program is a really good program. I think, one, we need to do a better job of getting the word out about the SkillBridge program, because I think, I come across people who have served sometimes and don't know. This is a program that essentially allows soldiers who are getting ready to leave the Army to be on the Army payroll for about 6 months, and to sort of start linking up to potential employers and kind of building that connective tissue so that they have a successful transition. I think, I would, love to maybe have somebody on my staff talk with you and hear a little bit more specifically about the kinds of obstacles that you encountered. But I think, I would welcome looking into how to expand SkillsBridge. I think we also need to, there are already programs like the First Lady, even when she was, Dr. Biden, when she was the wife of the Vice President, had a program with Michelle Obama called Joining Forces that was really focused on looking at how do we create, broader opportunities for veterans, employment opportunities, and partnering with companies to make sure that they were offering jobs to all of our great veterans. But there's always more work, I think, that we need to do in that area. And in terms of, again, behavioral health resources are something that the entire country has a shortage of. Particularly with so many people coming out of the pandemic with mental health challenges, everyone is looking for counselors, looking for licensed social workers. But we are really trying to make sure that we have those behavioral health resources available. And something I didn't realize, but actually now the Department of Veterans Affairs, in many cases, kind of has what I would call kind of urgent care clinics with licensed social workers available in shopping malls and things like that to try to get those resources out into the community more. And they're also available for active duty members of the military. So, you can actually be in the active force and take advantage of those kinds of resources.
We take SkillBridge interns, just saying, here at IOP. I believe there's a question over here.
Yes, thank you again for being here, ma'am. My name's Pierce. I'm an undergrad at the college and a cadet in our Air Force ROTC program. We've heard tonight what a wide policy range you have for the DoD and for the Army specifically, but if you could only make one change by the end of your tenure, what would that change be?
Oh, that's a great question. Oh, and a really hard one. If I could only make one change. That's a really, really hard one. I think if I could only do one thing, I think I really would want to see us, bring our sexual harassment and sexual assault incidents much, much lower. And here's why, because I mean, you might, as I'm formulating the answer to your question, I'm thinking, well, what about suicide? You know, that's something we struggle with. You know, obviously I want to minimize the number of people in the Army who die by suicide. Or, you know, maybe I'd like to renew the entire inventory of barracks across the United States Army. But I think, again, it goes to that comment I made earlier about the importance of having cohesive teams and the importance of people feeling like they can be safe and bring their best selves, you know, to their jobs every day. And that is something that impacts retention, and it's also something that impacts recruiting. You know, while the biggest obstacles for young people today to thinking about you know, joining the Army are fear of death or injury, fear of psychological harm, to include things like sexual harassment, and then fear of leaving friends and family. And so, you know, I feel like if we do not solve this recruiting challenge, we are not, and this again is a challenge that's not just hitting the United States Army, it's hitting every single one of our services, except maybe the Space Force, which is very, very small. But, you know, we have got to be able to have a military that's large enough to do the things that it needs to do to protect this nation. And that is foundational. So if there was one thing I could do that I think would help us with retention and recruitment, I think bringing sexual harassment and sexual assault rates down demonstrably would be important.
Wow. And so of the list that you just gave.
But there's like, that's the hardest question, because there's like 10 things I want to do that are all really important.
And when you went through that list of barriers to recruitment, did you do that in order of, or which one is that?
That's in order. That's in the top. Those are the top three. And that is across gender, that is across race. You know, those three barriers, if you will, are sort of universal for young people.
Okay. Was there a question over here?
Yes, thank you for being here. My name is Rick Furfer, and for what it's worth, I started my law career at Sidley and Austin in the 1970s.
It's a great firm.
We probably know a lot of people in common. You've spoken very eloquently about the administrative aspects of running the Army. I was curious to what extent, if any, you are drawn into actual military planning. For example, if Boko Haram did something bad in Africa, would you get a call in the middle of the night to help plan out what the response would be? Things like that.
I do not get a call in the middle of the night for that anymore. When I was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, I would sometimes get those calls. But as Secretary of the Army, I am still very much involved in those kinds of things, because basically it's my job as a service secretary to organize, man, train, and equip the Army, you know, to make sure that it has the weapon systems it needs to be able to do whatever it needs to do against al-Shabaab or whoever. And to make sure, you know, that we have the kinds of training that we need, the kinds of, you know, unit formations that we need. And it is and so, you know, I have to think about, to the question about sort of AI, what are the capabilities we need in the future? And to really understand that, I do get involved in things like the war plans that are developed by our, what we call combatant commanders. So we have, for example, an Army general right now is the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Also, he's dual-hatted as the European commander. You know, they have war plans that look at different contingencies, and the Army plays a big role in them. And so understanding those and making sure that we are providing the right capabilities and formations for those plans is something that I play a role in.
Hi, ma'am. Amanda, first year at Harris. I am curious, kind of in the vein of the change question, but a little different. You've mentioned the 12 weeks of parental leave a couple times. I'm also curious, over your tenure, what are kind of the demonstrable changes? You know, policies are very hard to kind of see to fruition, see to completion. So what else besides parental leave has made you very excited to see done? Or like, what is just coming down the chute that you're really excited about? You know, I think of the Department of the Army photos going away. That was a big change that I know for a while people were looking forward to. So I guess, what do you see coming to fruition soon, or has come to fruition?
So two things I would highlight. One is on the materiel side. The Army is undertaking right now the most ambitious modernization program that we've done in 40 years. So a lot of the systems, you know, that I mentioned that we're giving to the Ukrainians, Bradleys, Abrams tanks, Those are all things that the Army developed, a lot of our helicopters back in the 1980s, and we've sort of been incrementally modernizing them. But right now we're actually undertaking a program to build new systems, in some cases, unmanned systems, robotic combat vehicles, for example. And we're going to be starting to field or put prototypes in the hands of soldiers for 24 programs just this year. And it looks like, the Army kind of has a poor track record of acquisition of weapon systems. And because of a lot of changes that we've undertaken in how we develop those systems and how much we partner with industry and with our own soldiers to see what works for them, we're actually in a really good place, and I think are going to be bringing forward a lot of really important capabilities. So that's something I'm really excited about. And on the people side of things, another tremendous change that the Army has done, and this was, I will not take credit for this because it was starting before I became Secretary of the Army, and actually General McConville, my partner, was instrumental in this. We now have something called the Battalion Command Assessment Program. We also have the Colonel Command Assessment Program. We also have one for Sergeant Majors, who are a rank of some of our most senior NCOs. And basically, in the Army, we used to choose people for battalion command or brigade command by basically, kind of getting their files, seeing your basic stats and statistics, and then getting your officer evaluation reports, which are these, written documents. And frankly, I will say as a civilian, when I was working in the Office of Secretary of Defense and I would go to rate an officer, I would get these evaluations, and like everybody was the second coming of Jesus Christ. I mean, you were literally walking on water. And only if you were deeply in the Army and like had a secret decoder ring would you actually know how to read these reports to really figure out who was really great and who was maybe only so-so. Now we have completely overhauled how we do that. We still look at that paper file, but we basically bring in officers. They have a 360-degree review process. All of that feedback comes in. They take written tests. They do verbal tests. They are evaluated by an organizational psychologist. And then it culminates with sort of a double-blind panel where they basically are interviewed, and the panelists are general officers, and they are trained, by the way, in unconscious bias before they sit on the panel, which I think is a really important refinement. And so it's a much more comprehensive, holistic evaluation that we use to pick our most important leaders who are going to command soldiers in the field. It's really revolutionary. And I think one of the ways that I feel like the proof is in the pudding is that at the beginning of the process, you're ranked kind of 1 to N based on your paper file. And there's a certain percentage who by that ranking are not, they're at the bottom of the tier. But when you come out the other end of the assessment program, some of the people who were in the bottom of the order of merit list at the beginning of the process actually rise to the top and are selected for command. And that is because it's a much more comprehensive, it's just a much more comprehensive assessment. And I think it's going to have huge returns for us in terms of the quality of leaders, not just as masters of the profession of arms, doing the warfighting things, which again is our #1 mission, but also in the quality of people who can lead soldiers and human beings and take care of families. So you can see I'm really excited about it.
We have a question back here.
Hi, ma'am. Spencer Swice, former active duty captain, now at the Booth School of Business. Conveniently, I was my last job in the Army. I was the recruiting officer for downtown Chicago.
Wow.
So
tough job.
Yeah. Yep. You get it. So my question was going to be about how you or the Army at large was going to solve the recruiting and retention problem. You touched on that a little bit with this question over here. So my question a little bit may be now more of a devil's advocate. Do you ever think that the Army, is it imperative that it's as large as it is right now with advancements like you mentioned, AI or a Palantir, self-driving tanks? Does the Army need to be as large as it has been in the past?
Well, the Army isn't that large right now, as you probably know. I mean, our what we call end strength in the active Army, we're at about 465,000. As opposed to, we were well over 500,000 during a lot of the time of the last 200 years. And as I said, I think it's a pretty darn dangerous security environment out there. So I would not feel very comfortable right now with the Army getting smaller. In fact, I am really focused on seeing us grow back a little bit. And certainly, if we've got to turn our recruiting challenge around if we're going to kind of get back to a size that I think puts us on a healthier footing. I do think down the road, there will be some trade-offs. Some of the unmanned platforms that we're going to have, the artificial intelligence capabilities that we're going to have may allow us to offset, some of the sheer numbers of human beings we have in the Army now. But I think that analytical work to really understand that, it still lies ahead, because in many ways we're still doing the conceptual work of understanding how these new capabilities are really going to be integrated into formations and actually fight on the battlefield.
I think we have time for one more back here.
Ma'am, thank you so much for coming. My name is Hillary Carhill. I was active duty for 4 years as a judge advocate. My question for you, so we've seen some phenomenal females in recent years who physically were able to undergo the most grueling Army endeavors. And then we tried to change the PT test to being gender and age neutral. We had to change it back, had to generally acknowledge some physical differences. I'm just curious in how you see, because we had to acknowledge that there were generally some differences physically, how do you see that impacting women's abilities to join the combat arms groups?
Yeah, women are fully able to join the combat arms. And I think, we have now more than 100 women who've graduated from Ranger School, which is incredibly grueling. You asked me if I've taken the Army Combat Fitness Test. I have not taken the Army Combat Fitness Test. I think I could probably pass the plank, the run, a couple of other things. I almost gave myself a concussion trying to do the standing overhead throw. But even with now the age normed and gender normed test that we have for the Army Combat Fitness Test, it is a pretty darn difficult test. I think someone in the audience made a comment about it. But I would say, women are fully able to join the combat arms. And, if you're going to be a ranger, you're going to have some additional physical fitness requirements that you're going to have to be able to perform to qualify, for the ranger tab, for example. So, I think we need to have a basic fitness test that can show basically that, our soldiers, whether they're in the active guard or reserved, are physically fit enough to do what they need to do. And then for some of our, groups in the Army, there are additional physical requirements. So certainly, soldiers who are in our special operations community have additional requirements that they have to be able to fulfill. So I think we'll kind of continue to evolve. If you look at the history of the Army's physical fitness approach to the physical fitness test, we kind of got everybody on the bus many, many decades ago, and over time we tended to kind of raise the standards over time. So you want to have something that's that our test has been designed over the decades to have 5% of the force be able to max it, 5% of the force usually can't pass it, and they get separated, and then everyone in between is, somewhere in that bell curve.
Well, I think we're somewhere in the bell curve of the end of our conversation. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and for all of the active duty, the ROTCs, and the student veterans in the group. Please come over to IOP for other events. We'd love to see you there. Love to see more of you at all of our programming. And Madam Secretary, we know how busy you've been in Chicago. We appreciate very much that you took some of your time here to come spend it at the University of Chicago. And we just thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming out. Thanks, I really appreciate it.